The morning rain had turned the sidewalks into mirrors, reflecting the grey sky above and the tired faces of people rushing toward another ordinary workday. Daniel Carter stood quietly outside the towering headquarters of Kingston Global Industries, clutching a worn-out folder that contained little more than a janitor job application, a faded resume, and a lifetime of sacrifices no piece of paper could ever explain. His jacket had been stitched together so many times that the seams looked like scars, and his shoes carried the dust of years spent walking wherever life demanded. Beside him sat an old lunchbox, packed not with food for himself but with the sandwich he had prepared for his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, before dropping her off at school. Every morning he made sure she ate before he did. Every night he promised her that tomorrow would be better, even when he had no idea how to make that promise come true. Daniel had once owned a small construction company. It wasn't glamorous, but it had been honest work, enough to pay the bills and build a modest future with his wife, Emily. Then one devastating year changed everything. Emily was diagnosed with a rare illness that required expensive treatments. Daniel sold his trucks, borrowed against his home, emptied every savings account, and worked day and night to keep hope alive. When the treatments failed, he lost not only the love of his life but also his business, his house, and almost every possession he had ever earned. All that remained was Lily and the promise he whispered to Emily in the hospital during her final hours, that he would raise their daughter with kindness, dignity, and love no matter how difficult life became. Since then, Daniel had taken every job imaginable. He washed dishes in restaurants, unloaded delivery trucks before sunrise, cleaned office buildings after midnight, and repaired broken fences for neighbors willing to pay a few dollars. But temporary jobs disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Bills continued to pile up. Rent was overdue again, and the landlord had already hinted that patience was running out. Daniel didn't fear hunger for himself. He feared the day Lily might notice there was no food left in the kitchen. When he saw an online advertisement announcing that Kingston Global Industries was hiring janitors with full-time benefits, he didn't hesitate. It wasn't the salary that caught his attention. It was the health insurance. Lily suffered from severe asthma, and every hospital visit reminded him how vulnerable they truly were. A stable job meant medicine, security, and perhaps, for the first time in years, a chance to breathe without constant fear. Inside the magnificent glass building, polished marble floors stretched across a lobby larger than Daniel's old house had been. Executives in tailored suits walked confidently through automatic doors while security guards greeted employees by name. Daniel lowered his eyes, feeling invisible among people who seemed to belong to another world. He approached the reception desk with quiet humility. "I'm here for the janitor interview," he said softly. The receptionist barely looked up before handing him a visitor badge. "Third floor. Human Resources." Daniel thanked her sincerely. Kindness cost nothing, and he had never stopped believing it mattered. As the elevator doors opened on the third floor, nervousness settled into his chest. Other applicants sat in expensive clothes, scrolling through their phones and exchanging confident smiles. Daniel chose the farthest chair, trying not to wrinkle the only clean shirt he owned. One young applicant glanced at Daniel's worn clothing and smirked. "You sure you're in the right place?" Another laughed quietly. Daniel simply smiled. "I hope so." Years of hardship had taught him that responding to cruelty with anger only multiplied pain. When his name was finally called, he entered a modest interview room where 2 HR managers waited. They reviewed his resume with puzzled expressions. "You've done construction, warehouse work, maintenance, delivery driving. Why apply for janitorial services?" Daniel answered honestly. "Because honest work is honorable work. I don't need prestige. I need stability." One interviewer leaned back. "Cleaning 50 offices every night isn't easy." Daniel nodded. "Neither is burying your wife or telling your daughter that everything will be okay when you're not sure it will. Hard work doesn't scare me." Silence filled the room. For the first time that morning, someone looked at Daniel not as another applicant but as a father carrying invisible burdens. The interview continued. Daniel spoke with humility, never asking for sympathy, never mentioning his struggles. As they reached the storage room, the elderly maintenance worker thanked Daniel with a warm smile. "Most people walk right past me," he said quietly. "You stopped without being asked." Daniel shrugged gently. "My father used to tell me that if you have the strength to help someone, you already have enough to share." The old man chuckled. "Your father raised you well." Daniel smiled, though the compliment stirred memories that still hurt. He tried. Just then, the HR manager stepped into the hallway. Mr. Carter, thank you for coming. We'll review all applications and contact you within a few days. Daniel nodded politely. Thank you for your time. He knew what those words usually meant. He had heard them after dozens of interviews over the past 2 years. Still, he refused to let disappointment show. He shook each interviewer's hand, wished them a good day, and walked toward the elevator. As he crossed the lobby, he noticed a young boy, no older than 6, crying near the entrance. People hurried past without stopping. Daniel knelt beside him. Hey, buddy. Are you okay? I can't find my mommy, the little boy sobbed. Daniel stayed calm. Don't worry. We'll find her together. Within moments, security guards arrived, followed by a frantic woman who rushed over and hugged her son tightly. Oh, thank you, she said through tears. I only looked away for a minute. Daniel smiled. He's very brave. She tried to hand him some money, but Daniel politely declined. No, just take good care of him. Without waiting for further thanks, Daniel quietly left the building and walked toward the bus stop. High above the lobby, inside the executive offices, the CEO of Kingston Global Industries had just returned from an overseas business trip. Eleanor Kingston was known across the business world as a brilliant billionaire who had transformed her family's company into a global empire. Calm, disciplined, and respected, she rarely paid attention to entry-level hiring. But that afternoon, while reviewing employer reports, something unusual caught her attention. The elderly maintenance worker she had known for years entered her office. Ms. Kingston, he said, I met someone today you should know about. She looked up from her paperwork. A janitor applicant. Yes. What makes him special? The old man smiled. In 25 years, I've watched thousands of people walk these halls. Today, only one stopped to help an old cleaner push a heavy cart. Eleanor listened without speaking. He didn't know anyone was watching. That last sentence stayed with her. What's his name? She asked. The maintenance worker thought for a moment. Daniel Carter. The name barely registered. She thanked him and continued working, but curiosity lingered. Later that evening, HR sent over the list of applicants requiring final approval. Without thinking much about it, Eleanor flipped through the files. Then she reached one application. Daniel Carter. Her eyes stopped. Something about the name tugged at a memory buried deep inside her past. She slowly opened the folder. A simple photograph was attached. Older, tired, bearded. Yet those eyes. She froze. Her heartbeat quickened. It can't be. She whispered. For several long seconds she stared without moving. 20 years earlier, before she became one of the richest women in the country, Eleanor had been an ordinary college student struggling to pay tuition. One rainy night her car had broken down on a deserted highway. No phones. No traffic. No hope. Until a young construction worker had stopped his truck, repaired her engine in the pouring rain, and refused every dollar she offered. Instead he had smiled and said something she never forgot. One day, if life gives you the chance, help someone else. She had asked his name. Daniel Carter. She had searched for him afterward to repay his kindness but never found him. Could this exhausted janitor applicant be the same man? Or was it only a coincidence? Eleanor pressed the intercom. Bring me the complete employment file for Daniel Carter. Every document. Right away, Minutes later, the thicker file arrived. She opened it carefully. Employment history. Construction company owner. Widower. Single father. Current address. Everything matched the timeline. Her hands trembled. The man who had unknowingly changed the course of her life was now applying for the lowest paying position in her company. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO sat in complete silence. Outside her office, executives continued discussing billion-dollar contracts. Inside, Eleanor could think of only one question. How had the man who once helped a stranded stranger with nothing to gain lost everything? She closed the file slowly, stood up, and looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. Tomorrow morning, she said firmly, I want Daniel Carter back in this building. The assistant asked for a second janitor interview. Eleanor's expression became unreadable. No. A long pause followed. I want to meet him. Personally. Neither the assistant nor anyone else in the company understood why the billionaire CEO had suddenly cancelled 2 board meetings to make time for a janitor applicant. But by sunrise, every executive would be asking the same question. And when Daniel Carter walked back through those doors, none of them would be prepared for what was about to happen. The next morning, Daniel Carter stood once again in front of Kingston Global Industries, holding the same worn folder he had carried the day before. He couldn't understand why the company had called him back so quickly. As the city awakened around him, he whispered a silent prayer that whatever happened inside those glass walls would somehow bring a better future for his daughter, Lily. He wasn't expecting a miracle. He simply hoped for a chance. When he entered the lobby, something immediately felt different. Instead of being directed toward the Human Resources office, a receptionist smiled warmly and said, "Mr. Carter, we've been expecting you. Please come with me." Daniel looked confused but followed her without asking questions. They entered a private elevator that climbed to the executive floor, a place far beyond where janitor applicants would normally go. The doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with elegant artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The receptionist stopped outside a large wooden door engraved with a simple plaque, Chief Executive Officer. Daniel blinked in disbelief. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly. "I'm here about the janitor position." She smiled. "No mistake, sir. The CEO requested to meet you personally." Moments later, the door opened. Standing inside was Eleanor Kingston, the billionaire CEO whose leadership had made Kingston Global Industries one of the most respected companies in the country. She studied Daniel for several seconds, her expression calm but filled with emotion she struggled to hide. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "thank you for coming." Daniel nodded politely. "Please, have a seat." He sat carefully, feeling completely out of place. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Eleanor asked, "Do you remember helping a young woman on a rainy highway about 20 years ago? Her car had broken down." Daniel searched his memory. "I've helped a lot of people over the years." "She offered you money." "I usually refused." "You told her, if life ever gives you the chance, help someone else instead." Daniel smiled faintly. "I did say that." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I was that young woman." Daniel stared at her, stunned. "You?" She nodded. "I've spent years hoping I'd meet you again." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "I only changed a tire." "No," Eleanor replied. "You changed the way I looked at success. That night, I promised myself that if I ever had the opportunity, I'd build a company where character mattered more than status." Daniel lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the praise. "I'm glad life worked out for you." Eleanor looked at the file on her desk. "But it didn't work out for you." Daniel remained silent. "I read about your business. Your wife. Everything you lost." He took a slow breath. "Life doesn't owe us fairness." "No," Eleanor answered gently, "but sometimes it gives us another chance." Daniel expected her to offer him the janitor job. Instead, she slid another folder across the desk. Inside was an employment contract. Not for janitorial services. The position read, Facilities Operations Supervisor. Daniel looked up in confusion. "I think you've given me the wrong file." "I haven't. I've never managed a building this size." "You've managed construction crews, equipment, schedules, and people. Those skills don't disappear because life becomes difficult." Daniel shook his head. "I applied to clean floors." "You applied because you needed an opportunity. I'm offering one." For several seconds he couldn't speak. Finally he asked the only question that mattered. "Why would you trust someone like me?" Eleanor smiled. "Because 20 years ago you trusted a complete stranger without expecting anything in return." Daniel looked down at the contract again. His hands trembled. Not because of the salary. Not because of the title. But because, for the first time since losing his wife, someone had looked beyond his worn clothes and seen the man he still was inside. At that very moment, his phone buzzed. It was Lily. He answered immediately. "Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. Did you get the job?" Daniel looked across the desk at Eleanor. A tear rolled down his cheek. "I think our lives are about to change." Lily laughed happily without fully understanding why. As Daniel ended the call, Neither he nor Eleanor noticed that someone was watching through the glass wall outside the office. The company's chief financial officer had witnessed everything. And he wasn't pleased. He had his own plans for the company, and the sudden appearance of Daniel Carter threatened all of them. As he quietly walked away, he made a single phone call. "Find out everything you can about Daniel Carter," he said coldly. "If he's staying here, I want a reason to make sure he doesn't." Daniel barely slept that night. The unsigned employment contract rested on the small kitchen table, while Lily excitedly talked about all the things they could finally do if her father accepted the position. She dreamed of simple joys, a backpack without torn straps, a birthday cake that wasn't homemade from whatever ingredients they could afford, and medicine that didn't have to be rationed. Daniel listened with a smile, but deep inside he knew that accepting such a generous offer also meant carrying a responsibility far greater than a paycheck. He had always taught Lily that respect had to be earned through honesty, not through favors or luck. If he accepted the role, he wanted to prove he deserved it. The following morning, Daniel returned to Kingston Global Industries and signed the contract. Eleanor Kingston welcomed him with a firm handshake rather than a ceremonial speech. "You don't owe me anything for what happened 20 years ago," she said. "From this moment on, you're an employee like anyone else. Your work will speak for itself." Those words gave Daniel confidence. He spent the day walking through warehouses, office towers, maintenance rooms, and loading docks, introducing himself to janitors, electricians, plumbers, and security guards before meeting department managers. Instead of staying in executive offices, he put on work gloves and helped move supplies, repaired a broken storage rack, and joined the evening cleaning crew when one employee called in sick. Word spread quickly through the building that the new supervisor wasn't afraid to do the same work he asked of others. Not everyone admired that. The company's chief financial officer, Victor Hale, watched from a distance with growing frustration. He had expected Daniel to fail immediately. Instead, employees who had rarely smiled at work began greeting Daniel warmly. Productivity improved, complaints decreased, and morale rose. To Victor, that was dangerous. He believed loyalty should belong to executives, not to a newcomer who had arrived wearing worn-out shoes. Victor quietly ordered an internal review of Daniel's past. Investigators found nothing illegal, only unpaid debts, medical bills, and the collapse of his former construction company after his wife's illness. But Victor wasn't looking for the truth. He wanted something that could be twisted into suspicion. A few days later, expensive construction equipment disappeared from one of Kingston's storage facilities. Before security had finished checking surveillance footage, Victor called an emergency meeting. "The missing equipment was last recorded during Supervisor Carter's shift," he announced. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel stood calmly. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with this," he said, "check every camera, every access log, every record. I have nothing to hide." Victor smiled politely. "I'm sure we will." The atmosphere became tense. Rumors spread through the company before facts could. Some employees who had praised Daniel only days earlier began wondering whether the quiet, humble supervisor had hidden secrets after all. Eleanor refused to rush to judgment. "I want evidence," she said firmly, "not assumptions." Security specialists spent hours reviewing footage from dozens of cameras. Finally, they found something unexpected. The missing equipment had never left the building through Daniel's work area. Instead, it had been moved through a restricted loading dock using an executive access card. Only 5 people possessed that level of authorization. Daniel wasn't one of them. As the investigation continued, another surprise emerged. Security footage showed Daniel staying nearly an hour after his shift had ended, not near the missing equipment, but helping an injured maintenance worker finish repairs after everyone else had gone home. The accusations against him collapsed instantly. Victor tried to hide his disappointment, but Eleanor noticed. Later that evening, she called Daniel into her office. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," she said. Daniel smiled gently. "I've learned something over the years." "What's that?" "The truth sometimes walks slowly, but lies usually get tired before it arrives." Eleanor couldn't help smiling. "You still have a way of saying exactly what people need to hear." Daniel stood to leave. Before he reached the door, Eleanor spoke again. "I didn't hire you because I owed you a favor." Daniel turned back. "I know. I hired you because people like you are rare." Daniel nodded quietly. "And I'll spend every day proving your trust wasn't misplaced." As he walked out, neither of them realized that Victor had become even more determined. His first plan had failed, but he wasn't finished. He opened a locked drawer in his office, removed a thick file connected to Kingston Global's oldest business secrets, and whispered to himself, "If Daniel Carter wants to stay here, he'll have to survive what's coming next." Meanwhile, Daniel arrived home to find Lily waiting by the apartment window. She ran into his arms, laughing as he told her about his first week. For the first time in years, hope no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt real. But hope has a way of attracting those who fear losing power. And somewhere inside Kingston Global Industries, a much larger battle had only just begun.